This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Good evening. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present. Mr. John Story, Chancellor, and Mrs. Virginia Story, Professor Paul Greenfield, AO, Vice Chancellor, and Ms. Louise Greenfield, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Laureate and Professor of Economics, Columbia University, and inaugural Rod Wiley, Eminent Visiting Fellow to the University of Queensland, and Mrs. Annie Stiglitz. Mr. John Wiley, AM, Managing Director, Lazards. Mr. Rodney Wiley, OBE, the Honorable Paul Keating, former Prime Minister and Chairman, Corporate Advisory International, Lazards. Mr. Michael Knox, Queensland Chair of the Economics Society of Australia, members of the University Senate and Senior Executive. Colleagues, especially those from the UQ Faculty of Business, Economics and Law. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to another University of Queensland's superb centenary oration series. It's great to have so many people here at UQ this evening to help celebrate our centenary and to hear from one of our planet's leading minds. The School of Economics and the Business School are especially proud to have helped bring you tonight's event. In the audience, we have future students, current students who have just completed the first day of school, back to school, and many distinguished alumni, colleagues, and guests. Welcome to you all. Tonight's lecture gives us an opportunity to see how economists observe what's going on around us and how their perspective helps shape current and future events. Throughout history, from Smith to Keynes, from Friedman to Krugman, great economists have played a pivotal role in our social, intellectual, and civil development. Their contribution is central to our way of life, and tonight's speaker is one such great economist. Our event format is we'll have a welcome by the Vice Chancellor, a 45 minutes oration, followed by 20 minutes of questions, and then we'll have a book signing and refreshments outside. Before I welcome the Vice Chancellor to the podium to introduce our guest, I would like to offer a special thank you to UQ alumnus, Mr. Michael Knox of the Economics Society of Australia, and their eminent speaker series partners, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Qantas, for providing us with this opportunity. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Greenfield, who will welcome our orator for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Laureate and Professor of Economics, Columbia University, and inaugural Rod Wiley, Eminent Visiting Fellow to the University of Queensland. Mr. John Wiley, AM, Managing Director, Lazards. Mr. Rodney Wiley, OBE. The Honourable Paul Keating, former Prime Minister and Chairman, Corporate Advisory International, Lazards. Mr. Michael Knox, Queensland Chair of the Economic Society of Australia. Members of the University Senate and Senior Executive. Professor Flavio Menezes, Head of School of Economics. UQ colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as with Flavio, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's UQ Centenary Oration. This is the 7th in a free series which was created as part of the celebration of the start of our 2nd century. And they were created for the community to enjoy. For the centenary, the university's assembled a lineup of world-class speakers. We've heard already from one of the lead scientists on NASA's Mars rover mission, the United Nations Director General, and a leading international oceanographer. Later this year, we will host the President and CEO of the Dow Chemical Company, Dr. Andrew Liveris, who's a UQ alumnus, and Professor Michael Stratton, a brilliant UK-based cancer researcher. All centenary orators are outstanding in their fields, but only tonight's speaker, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Professor of Economics at Columbia University, is a Nobel Laureate. His reputation, both as an economist and as a speaker, is attested to by the level of attendance at tonight's function. The winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics helped develop a new branch of economics, which might be termed the economics of information, and in particular, explaining asymmetric information flows in markets and their impact on markets. And this has been key to understanding a wide range of phenomena, as wide as credit rationing on the one hand and moral hazard on the other, and has pointed to new avenues for selective government intervention to improve social conditions. Currently, his focus includes the causes of and policy responses to the global financial crisis and the analysis of economic tools used to address climate change. He has held a string of highly influential appointments, including Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of the World Bank and Chair of the United Nations Commission of Experts on Reform of the International Financial and Monetary System. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages, and many of you will have studied or be currently studying his theories. I was fascinated by one of his books, published in 2001, Globalization and Discontent. It has been translated into 35 languages. But what's interesting is that he actually has had two pirated versions of that book. I wonder how many academics can put on their CV that they've actually had pirated versions of their publications. Tonight I have pleasure in announcing Professor Stiglitz as the inaugural Rodney Wiley Eminent Visiting Fellow to the University of Queensland. This fellowship was created in 2009 from a very generous gift of Mr. John Wiley AM in honour of his father, Rodney Wiley OBE. Rodney is a distinguished UQ graduate in Commerce and Arts who continues to loyally support his alma mater. The gift of his son, yet another exemplary alumnus of the Wiley family, will enable the university to bring a globally respected academic here each year. I thank John and his family very much, not just for their generosity, but for the leadership that they are showing in how successful alumnus can contribute back to the university to help it reach higher levels. Before welcoming Professor Stiglitz to the stage, could I also thank the University School of Economics and Business School for their involvement in tonight's event, and also the Economic Society of Australia. I would also like to acknowledge our media partners, ABC Radio, both Radio National and 612, and the Courier Mail. I look forward to catching up with a number of you during refreshments and at other UQ events during 2010 and beyond. It is now my honour to invite Professor Joseph Stiglitz to present his lecture, Free Fall, Free Markets and the Sinking of the Global Economy.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to participate with you in your centenary celebration. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit less celebratory. It's about, as I said, the sinking of the global economy, the mistakes in economic policies that contributed to it, and the lessons that ought to be drawn for economic policy, but also for economic theory, the kind of economics that we teach in academia. So there are three questions I'm going to be dealing with this evening. First, where are we in the global crisis? You here in Australia have been spared a great deal of the crisis, and you may not really fully realize the impact that it is having in the rest of the world. You've contributed by an acronym, the GFC, which is not yet used elsewhere in the world, but I think will eventually spread around. But the crisis, as I'll try to explain, is only partway through and is likely to last for at least several years. Much of what I want to talk about, though, is how do we get here, and what are the lessons? How do we get to a more stable and prosperous economy? To begin with, the question about where we are and in the evolution of this the crisis, we have clearly pulled back from the brink that we were in September 2008. But to paraphrase a cliche, we're not out of the woods yet. The world is not yet on the course of a robust recovery. In fact, the prospects are that growth will slow down towards the end of this year or early next year. As we look over the global horizon, the only source of strength is in Asia. Europe and America are heading to slow economic growth, and in fact, some countries are likely to be facing a double dip, that their growth will actually go so slow as to become negative. The key problem is that before the crisis, global growth was supported by a series of bubbles. First, we had the tech bubble, and we replaced the tech bubble with a housing bubble. The housing bubble was there were real estate bubbles in many countries around the world, but perhaps the largest was in the United States. Many economic leaders, people like Alan Greenspan, talked about a new economy, and they thought that financial innovation and deregulation have brought us to this new economy in which economic downturns would be a thing of the past. Recessions would be things we no longer had to talk about. But in fact, this financial innovation, this deregulation, actually allowed the bubble to grow bigger and bigger. And actually, as you look at what happened in this crisis, for all the innovation, the crisis, in fact, is much like the crises that have plagued capitalism throughout its history. So in that sense, it's nothing new. There are a couple new words like CDOs, derivatives that didn't play a role in previous crises, but actually, if you look at the history of crises, in many of the previous earlier crises, there was some form of innovation that was associated with the crisis, financial innovation. If we look at the history of capitalism, the history of market economies, there have only been a short period of 3 decades, the 3 decades after the Great Depression, when the world did not face crisis after crisis. And the reason was that in response to the Great Depression in the United States and in most other countries of the world, there were a set of regulations. Regulatory institutions like the Securities and Exchange Commissions. And these actually worked reasonably well in preventing crises. The result was that, in fact, a mistaken view arose. The view was that markets on their own were efficient, were self-correcting, and in that sense were stable. But in fact, as I've said, the markets worked well in the decades after the Great Depression because we had good regulation. And then, in the 3 decades after deregulation began under Thatcher and in the UK, under Reagan in the United States, there have been crises after crises, more than 100 financial crises around the world, most of them in developing countries, but some of them in developed countries.